It is 5:01 p.m. on March 20th, 2023. I'm going to continue the reading of V.I. Lenin, The State and Revolution, recommencing at page 42 with Chapter 3, The State and Revolution, Experience of the Paris Commune of 1871, Marx's Analysis. 1. Wherein lay the heroism of the Communards' attempt? It is well known that in the autumn of 1870, a few months before the Commune, Marx warned the Paris workers that any attempt to overthrow the government would be the folly of despair. But when, in March 1871, a decisive battle was forced upon the workers, and they accepted it, when the uprising had become a fact, Marx greeted the proletarian revolution with the greatest enthusiasm, in spite of unfavorable auguries. Marx did not assume the rigidly pedantic attitude of condemning an untimely movement, as did the ill-famed Russian renegade from Marxism, Plekhanov, who in November 1905 wrote encouragingly about the workers' and peasant struggle, but after December 1905 cried liberal fashion, quote, "They should not have taken to arms," end quote. Marx, however, was not only enthusiastic about the heroism of the Communards, who, as he expressed it, stormed heaven. Although the mass revolutionary movement did not achieve its aim, he regarded it as a historic experience of enormous importance, as a certain advance of the world proletarian revolution, as a practical step that was more important than hundreds of programs and arguments. To analyze this experiment, to draw tactical lessons from it, to re-examine his theory in the light of it, that was the task that Marx set himself. The only correction Marx thought it necessary to make in the Communist Manifesto, he made on the basis of the revolutionary experience of the Paris Communards. The last preface to the new German edition of the Communist Manifesto, signed by both its authors, is dated June 24, 1872. In this preface, the authors, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, say that the program of the Communist Manifesto, quote, has in some details become antiquated, end quote. And they go on to say, quote, one thing especially was proved by the Commune, viz., that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes, end quote. The authors took the words that are in single quotation marks in this passage from Marx's book, The Civil War in France. Thus, Marx and Engels regarded one principal and fundamental lesson of the Paris Commune as being of such enormous importance that they introduced it as a substantial correction into the Communist Manifesto. It is extremely characteristic that it is precisely this substantial correction that has been distorted by the opportunist, and its meaning probably is not known to 9/10, if not 99/100 of the readers of the Communist Manifesto. We shall deal with this distortion more fully further on in a chapter devoted specially to distortions. Here it will be sufficient to note that the current vulgar interpretation of Marx's famous utterance, just quoted, is that Marx here allegedly emphasizes the idea of slow development in contradistinction to the seizure of power, and so on. As a matter of fact, exactly the opposite is the case. Marx's idea is that the working class must break up, smash, the ready-made state machinery and not confine itself merely to laying hold of it. On April 12, 1871, i.e., just at the time of the Commune, Marx wrote to Kugelmann, quote, if you look at the last chapter of my 18th Brumaire, you will find that I say that the next attempt of the French Revolution will be no longer, as before, to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to another, but to smash it. Marx's italics, the original is zerbration. And this is the preliminary condition for every real people's revolution on the continent. And this is what our heroic party comrades in Paris are attempting. Noisette, Volume 21, 1901-02, page 700. End quote. The letters of Marx to Kugelman have appeared in Russian in no less than 2 editions, one of which I edited and supplied with a preface. The words, "to smash the bureaucratic military machine," briefly express the principal lesson of Marxism regarding the task of the proletariat during a revolution in relation to the state. And it is precisely this lesson that has been not only completely forgotten, but positively distorted by the prevailing Kautskyite interpretation of Marxism. As for Marx's reference to the 18th Brumaire, we have quoted the corresponding passage in full above. It is interesting to note in particular 2 points in the above quoted argument of Marx. First, he confines his conclusion to the continent. This was understandable in 1871, when England was still the model of a purely capitalist country, but without a militarist clique and, to a considerable degree, without a bureaucracy. Hence, Marx excluded England, where a revolution, even a people's revolution, then seemed possible, and indeed was possible, without the preliminary condition of destroying the ready-made state machinery. Today, in 1917, in the epoch of the first great imperialist war, this qualification made by Marx is no longer valid. Both England and America, the biggest and the last representatives in the whole world of Anglo-Saxon liberty, is in the sense that they had no militarist cliques and bureaucracy, have today completely sunk into the old European filthy, bloody morass of bureaucratic military institutions, which subordinate everything to themselves and trample everything underfoot. Today in England and in America, too, the preliminary conditions for every real people's revolution is the smashing, the destruction of the ready-made state machinery, perfected in those countries between 1914 and 1917 up to the European general imperialist standard. Secondly, particular attention should be paid to Marx's extremely profound remark that the destruction of the bureaucratic military state machine is the preliminary condition for every real people's revolution. This idea of a people's revolution seems strange coming from Marx, so that the Russian Plekhanovites and Mensheviks, those followers of Struve who wish to be regarded as Marxist, might possibly declare such an expression to be a slip of the pen on Marx's part. They've reduced Marxism to such a state of wretchedly liberal distortion that nothing exists for them beyond the antithesis between bourgeois revolution and proletarian revolution. And even this antithesis they interpret in an extremely lifeless way. If we take the revolution of the 20th century as examples, we shall, of course, have to admit that the Portuguese and the Turkish revolutions are both bourgeois revolutions. Neither of them, however, is a people's revolution, inasmuch as in neither does the mass of the people, its enormous majority, come out actively, independently, with its own economic and political demands to any noticeable degree. On the contrary, although the Russian bourgeois revolution of 1905-07 displayed no such brilliant successes as at times fell to the lot of the Portuguese and Turkish revolutions, it was undoubtedly a real people's revolution, since the mass of the people, its majority, the very lowest social strata, crushed by oppression and exploitation, rose independently and placed on the entire course of the revolution the impress of their own demands, of their attempts to build in their own way a new society in place of the old society that was being destroyed. In Europe, in 1871, there was not a single country on the continent in which the proletariat constituted the majority of the people. A people's revolution, one that actually swept the majority into its stream, could be such only if it embraced both the proletariat and the peasantry. These two classes then constituted the people. These two classes are united by the fact that the bureaucratic military state machine oppresses, crushes, exploits them. To smash this machine, to break it up, this is truly the interest of the people, of the majority, of the workers and most of the peasants. This is the preliminary condition for a free alliance between the poorest peasants and the proletarians, whereas without such an alliance, democracy is unstable and socialist transformation is impossible. As is well known, the Paris Commune was indeed working its way towards such an alliance, although it did not reach its goal owing to a number of circumstances, internal and external. Consequently, in speaking of a real people's revolution, Marx, without in the least forgetting the peculiar characteristics of the petty bourgeoisie, he spoke a great deal about them and often, took strict account of the actual balance of class forces in the majority of continental countries in Europe in 1871. On the other hand, he stated that the smashing of the state machine was required by the interests of both the workers and the peasants, that it unites them, that it places before them the common task of removing the parasite and of replacing it by something new. By what exactly? We are at section 2. With what is the smashed state machine to be replaced? In 1847, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx's answer to this question was as yet a purely abstract one, or, to speak more correctly, it was an answer that indicated the task, but not the ways of accomplishing them. The answer given in the Communist Manifesto was that this machine was to be replaced by the proletariat organized as the ruling class, by the winning of the battle of democracy. Marx did not indulge in utopias. He expected the experience of the mass movement to provide the reply to the question as to what specific forms this organization of the proletariat as the ruling class will assume, and as to the exact manner in which this organization will be combined with the most complete, most consistent winning of the battle of democracy. Marx subjected the experience of the Commune, meager as it was, to the most careful analysis in the Civil War in France. Let us quote the most important passages of this work. Quote, originating from the Middle Ages, there developed in the 19th century the centralized state power with its ubiquitous organs of standing army, police, bureaucracy, clergy, and judicature. With the developments of the class antagonism between capital and labor, the state power assumed more and more the character of the national power of capital over labor, of a public force organized for social enslavement, of an engine of class despotism. After every revolution marking a progressive phase in the class struggle, the purely repressive character of the state power stands out in bolder and bolder relief. After the revolution of 1848 to 49, the state power became the national war engine of capital against labor. The Second Empire consolidated this. The direct antithesis of the empire was the commune. It was the positive form of a republic that was not only to supersede the monarchical form of class rule, but class rule itself. End quote. What was this positive form of the proletarian? The socialist republic? What was the state it began to create? Quote, the first decree of the commune was the suppression of the standing army and the substitution for it of the armed people. End quote. This demand now figures in the program of every party claiming the name of socialist. But the real worth of their programs is best shown by the behavior of our socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, who, right after the revolution of February 27, actually refused to carry out this demand. Quote, the commune was formed of the municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at short terms. The majority of its members were naturally working men or acknowledged representatives of the working class. Instead of continuing to be the agent of the central government, the police was at once stripped of its political attributes and turned into the responsible and at all times revocable agent of the commune. So were the officials of all of the branches of the administration. From the members of the commune downwards, the public service had to be done at workmen's wages. The vested interest and the representation allowances of the high dignitaries of state disappeared along with the high dignitaries themselves. Having once got rid of the standing army and the police, the physical force elements of the old government, the commune was anxious to break the spiritual force of the repression, the parson power. The judicial functionaries were to be divested of that sham independence. They were to be elective, responsible, and revocable. End quote. Thus, the commune appears to have replaced the smashed state machine only by fuller democracy, abolition of the standing army, all officials to be elected and subject to recall. But as a matter of fact, this only signifies a gigantic replacement of certain institutions by other institutions of a fundamentally different order. This is exactly a case of quantity becoming transformed into quality. Democracy introduced as fully and consistently as is at all conceivable is transformed from bourgeois democracy into proletarian democracy, and from the state equal a special force for the suppression of a particular class into something which is no longer really the state. It is still necessary to suppress the bourgeoisie and crush its resistance. This was particularly necessary for the Commune, and one of the reasons for its defeat was that it did not do this with sufficient determination. But the organ of suppression is now the majority of the population, and not a minority, as was always the case under slavery, serfdom, and wage slavery. And since the majority of the people itself suppresses its oppressors, a special force for suppression is no longer necessary. In this sense, the state begins to wither away. Instead of the special institutions of a privileged minority, privileged officialdom, the chiefs of the standing army, the majority itself can directly fulfill all these functions, and the more the functions of state power devolve upon the people as a whole, the less need is there for the existence of this power. In this connection, the following measures of the Commune emphasized by Marx are particularly noteworthy. The abolition of all representation allowances and of all monetary privileges in the case of the officials, the reduction of the remuneration of all servants of the state to the level of workmen's wages. This shows more clearly than anything else the turn from bourgeois democracy to proletarian democracy, from the democracy of the oppressors to the democracy of the oppressed classes, from the state as a special force for the suppression of a particular class to the suppression of the oppressors by the general force of the majority of the people, the workers and the peasants. And it is precisely on this particularly striking point, perhaps the most important as far as the problem of the state is concerned, that the teachings of Marx have been most completely forgotten. In popular commentaries, the number of which is legion, this is not mentioned. It is good form to keep silent about it, as if it were a piece of old-fashioned naivete. Just as the Christians, after the religion had been given the status of a state religion, forgot the naivete of primitive Christianity and its democratic revolutionary spirit. The reduction of the remuneration of the highest state officials seems to be simply a demand of naive primitive democracy. One of the founders of modern opportunism, the ex-social democrat Eduard Bernstein, has more than once indulged in repeating the vulgar bourgeois jeers at primitive democracy. Like all opportunists, and like the present Kautskyeites, he utterly failed to understand that, first of all, the transition from capitalism to socialism is impossible without a certain reversion to primitive democracy. For how else can the majority, and then the whole population, without exception, proceed to discharge state functions? And secondly, that primitive democracy based on capitalism and capitalist culture is not the same as primitive democracy in prehistoric or pre-capitalist times. Capitalist culture has created large-scale production, factories, railways, the postal service, telephones, etc., and on this basis, the great majority of the functions of the old state power have become so simplified and can be reduced to such exceedingly simple operations of registration, filing, and checking that they can be easily performed by every literate person, can quite easily be performed for ordinary working men's wages, and that these functions can and must be stripped of every shadow of privilege, of every semblance of official grandeur. All officials, without exception, elected and subject to recall at any time, their salaries reduced to the level of ordinary workmen's wages. These simple and self-evident democratic measures, while completely uniting the interests of the workers and the majority of the peasants, at the same time serve as a bridge leading from capitalism to socialism. These measures concern the reconstruction of the state, the purely political reconstruction of society, but of course, they acquire their full meaning and significance only in connection with the expropriation of the expropriators, either being accomplished or in preparation, i.e., with the transformation of capitalist private ownership of the means of production into social ownership. Quote, "The Commune," Marx wrote, "made the catchword of bourgeois revolutions, cheap government, a reality by destroying the two greatest sources of expenditure, the standing army and state functionaryism." End quote. From the peasantry, as from other sections of the petty bourgeoisie, only an insignificant few rise to the top, get on in the world in the bourgeois sense, i.e., become either well-to-do people, bourgeois, or officials in secure and privileged positions. In every capitalist country where there is a peasantry, and there is in most capitalist countries, the vast majority of the peasants are oppressed by the government and long for its overthrow, long for cheap government. This can be achieved only by the proletariat, and by achieving it, the proletariat at the same time takes a step towards the socialist reconstruction of the state. I'm going to end here at the bottom of page 53.